Welcome to the webinar, Desktop Accessibility Through Eye Tracking, Exploring Computer Access and the Application of Eye Gaze with Tobii Dynavox. This webinar is hosted by the Network of Assistive Technologists on this Friday, the 11th of June, 2021. From Tobii Dynavox, we are joined today by Charles Poeppelman, and Charles brings many skills to his role as a Tobii Dynavox solutions consultant. As a speech-language pathologist who specializes in augmentative and alternative communication, Charles provides communication, computer access, and technology solutions to clinical professionals and their clients. Active with many groups, Charles focuses on facilitating trainings on assistive technologies and advocacy at the provincial and national levels, creating successful communication opportunities for all Canadians. So welcome, Charles, and thank you for joining us today. With that said, I now want to hand over the screen sharing to you, Charles, as you begin today's presentation for us.
Thank you so much, Doug, as well as I really appreciate the warm welcome from the Network of Assistive Technologists. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here and be able to pull up this PowerPoint presentation. I want to thank everybody for being here today. Hopefully you're able to hear my audio okay.
Everything seems to be coming through. That's great.
All right, perfect. Okay, so once again, my name is Charles Poeppelman. I'm a full-time employee of Tobii Dynavox North America. I work within our Canadian division. It's a small team. We're housed within Ontario. Many of you, I don't know if you work within the Ontario or Greater Toronto area. You may know my counterpart, Danielle Franklin, but her and I make up the majority of the Canadian team. And today, I'd like to be able to share with you some of our supports and training when it comes to desktop accessibility through eye tracking. We're going to be exploring eye tracking in terms of modality. We're going to be going over some different access methods within computer access, and then looking at Tobii and Tobii Dynavox as a whole, Tobii's commitment to accessibility both within the workplace and for individuals with complex access needs. By background, I am a speech-language pathologist, as Doug had mentioned. I specialize within augmentative and alternative communication, so I work with a lot of individuals with complex access needs that have functional impairments, either an impairment of physical function with their body and not being able to ambulate, to be able to gain access to a computerized system, or to communication supports. So we have to find really interesting ways of being able to provide individuals with access, and there are many different ways that we can execute that, and I'd love to be able to share that with you today. I just want to share a brief thank you, really from the bottom of our hearts, to the Network of Assistive Technologists, all of your members, as well as the guests here that come from all different avenues within assistive technology. The year of 2020 and the global pandemic has really stretched a lot of organizations, a lot of different associations very thin, and has really provided a lot of interesting challenges for companies around the world. And Tobii Dynavox is definitely one of them. Us and our partners within the assistive technology industry have had to make some extensive changes to the way that we provide trainings to clinical professionals, educators, to caregivers that support individuals with complex access needs. And I just want to share our very deep gratitude to the profession, to the individuals that you support. If you're a caregiver, we thank you. If you're an educator, we thank you. If you're a clinician, we thank you. As well as I just want to share just briefly, our motto here at Tobii Dynavox is that, in here you can see this on the third paragraph on the slide, is that we empower people with disabilities to do what they once did or never thought possible. And we really live by that motto here. Within our 90-person international team of solutions consultants, all of us come from very diverse backgrounds. Some of us are assistive technologists, some of us are special educators, speech language pathologists, OTs, many different professionals from the allied health profession. And then also individuals that come from different backgrounds, different professions, whether that be in the medical service industry or whether that be biomedical engineers. So there's a very large group of us that try to work to support different professionals and caregivers, and we all share in this deep gratitude for what it is that you do. So thank you again. So what I'd like to do is I always try to provide some sort of learning outcomes. Hopefully this gives you kind of a guide of what we're going to be covering today. We're going to start again with defining some modes of access. Some of this may be some review for you, especially if you come from the assistive technology industry. I just think it's really great to go over some of this information again as it relates to some of the content that we're going to cover today. And then also we're going to be discussing some alternative access and the significance of accessibility. When we talk about accessibility, a lot of times we talk about accessibility in the presence of a loss of function, and that's not an entirely correct way of looking at accessibility, because accessible tools are available to the general population as much as they are available to those with functional impairments. So it's really, really important when we look at accessibility, we talk about all of humanity. We talk about all of us together using tools, using computers to be able to make our lives more accessible. Okay, so we're going to be going over a little bit of that as well. And then number three, we're going to be reviewing some eye tracking history as well as our company's commitment to accessibility. And if you don't know maybe some of the history into eye tracking, I think that that'll be a really nice review to be able to go over some of that information, kind of where we've been and then where we're going. And then lastly, we're going to be looking at the application of peripheral eye tracking systems. I invite you, if you can, to continue to stay tuned to the presentation. We should be wrapping up right around the 60-minute mark. I will be opening up things for questions. So we will have a little bit of a Q&A at the end of this presentation. But Doug had said that he'll be monitoring the chat window throughout the presentation. So thank you so much for doing that, Doug. And then if there are some looming questions that kind of stick out, I have encouraged Doug to make sure that he can cut me off at any time and we can get to those questions. But I really appreciate you guys being here, and then we'll get started right here. So going over some access methods, I think it's really, really important that we determine, what does access method mean? And that's just the way or function in which we access a system. Okay, and that system can be a simple system or it could be a complex system. When we talk about a simple system, we could talk about something as easy as using a communication board. Whether we write something, we could write yes and no on a piece of paper, and then we categorize it into two different areas. Yes, maybe I look towards my left for yes, maybe I look towards my right for no. So we have standalone systems that don't operate off of computers, such as using a simple communication board, or we might be peering towards a hotspot towards on a board. So sometimes within the classroom setting, you might have a student using what we call visual board, where you actually cut a window within a board, and then the student can peer towards one side or the other to make determinations. Or maybe we actually put for augmentative communication, maybe we put 4 different selections on that simple board, and they can peer, and now they have 4 different things that they can communicate about. But they're still using some sort of a visual access, but it is still very, very simple. So here we have some standalone access methods. And when we talk about standalone, sometimes we try to group everything with touch into one category. And that's really not the case. There are different types of touch access. When we talk about folks with cerebral palsy, sometimes the gross motor commands that our brain sends to our hands when we go to ambulate, when an individual has cerebral palsy, the fine motor commands are very difficult for a user. So maybe they're able to move their arm towards a screen, but as soon as they get there, they need some sort of support, whether that be support at their core. We can provide some sort of support, whether it be a brace to their chest while they're in like some sort of a reclined chair, or maybe we need to provide some sort of arm brace to be able to support their more fine motor movements, because their movement is really defined by that gross motor, and it's very, very difficult for them to execute those fine motor commands. So maybe we might employ a strategy like touch exit, because I know that a user can get their hand to a screen, but as soon as they get to a screen, they need the additional support. So maybe they have to slide their hand across the screen and then let go, and that's when their switch activates. Okay, so there's different methods to when we're talking about touch, and that's just, I think, an important consideration there. So then moving to computer-based access methods, we really kind of opened up Pandora's box here with what is available and the different kinds of supports that are out there and the different kinds of access methods. So we have everything from touch. We can utilize switch access. So many of you are probably familiar with switch scanning, and that there's lots of different ways that we can utilize switch scanning, whether it be, we have a user that's using a computer and it goes across the row, And then after they make a selection, it might then go across the column. So you have row column scanning, and then you also have something called group-based scanning, where we might do quadrant scanning, where it goes into each of the corners of the device. And then from there, it goes into more of a finer, so it starts broadly and then it goes into and it gets more specific as the user makes selections. And that's just one form of switch access. You might employ multiple switches to execute multiple commands, okay? Additionally, you also have head mice and eye gaze. So in separating these access methods, you have direct and indirect access. Direct access allows the user to determine what it is they want to execute, the action that they want to execute right away. Okay, they're able to make some sort of a movement, whether that be with their eyes, their head, with touch, to be able to make a selection. Versus indirect access method, we might be using a caregiver to maybe watch where we're looking. We might be utilizing a switch. So with a switch, again, our selections have to scan across the screen and a user has to wait to be able to make a selection. So they can't go directly to the button or to the switch that they want to access. They need to have some sort of a window to be able to access that information. Okay, I see that. I'm not sure if my screen sharing had just shut off there.
Yeah, apologize, Charles. Not sure what happened. Try starting it again. It popped out for some
No
reason.
worries. There we go. I think
Okay.
we've got it again. Okay, so that's just sort of covering the different kinds of computer-based access methods. Now, we also have something, and I think this is a really important consideration to look at, especially for this content, is something called multimodal access. So it's important that we can't just fit one access method into a box and say, okay, we can only use a switch with this user, or we can only use touch access, because that's not functional. And that's actually not really the way that we operate within assistive technology or within using technology in general. And we're going to get to a little bit more of this as the presentation goes on. But sometimes we might need to look at options where we use more than one switch. Here you can see this user in front of me has both an eye gaze bar at the bottom of her workstation, as well as a switch onto the side of her face. So we might need to be able to, so when we're talking about accessibility and she's accessing the system, she's using her eyes to move her mouse cursor across the screen, and then maybe she's executing a double click when she uses her switch. Okay, so multimodal, more than one mode of access. And that's important when we're talking about providing a customized solution for a user, whether it be a student in the classroom or whether it be looking at an individual's workstation. Especially when we're talking about the presence of degenerative and progressive diseases within the workforce and trying to keep individuals as employed as long as possible as their disease progresses. So when we look at these different options, when we look at access methods, it might be a combination of the two, or maybe it might be three different forms of access methods. So it really provides a lot of specificity. We can really get very specific and can really provide a much more customized solution for an individual with complex access needs. So let's talk about briefly the benefits of exploring alternative access. So looking at student buy-in, if we go to like the university setting, or we look at school districts and working with students, because many assistive technologists, allied health professionals, special educators, caregivers, at some point, many times, whether it be a user that has some sort of a congenital diagnosis, so they had the diagnosis from early on, maybe even when they were neonatal, and now they're progressing into adulthood or they're working through their school years, they need some sort of form of alternative access. And what we want to do is we want to facilitate the student to buy into instruction. And that's so important. If we think about typical verbal communicators or even so looking at just one form of this. So we have nonverbal and then we have folks that are verbal, and they're able to verbalize exactly what their communication is. So maybe a student needs to use alternative access in a computerized system to be able to communicate. Okay. So it's really important when we're talking about this in normal communication between two different typical communicators, two different typical students. What happens is you're gaining so much more than just the communication piece. We're sharing emotion. We're sharing an experience in our instruction. When our teacher says, we need to get together in groups to collaborate, amongst ourselves to think about something. We're also students and kiddos pick up on social cues through communication. And being able to cope with different emotions and when different students have different rebuttals. Maybe we rise to anger. Maybe we have to sit back and try and understand something. So when we're talking about processing communication and processing social interaction, we want to get students to buy into that instruction. So using an alternative form of access to allow them, if they need to use a computerized system, to participate within the communication during the instruction in the classroom. That is worth exploring because it's so much more than just the communication piece. It's also getting the student to be really a part of that instruction. Looking at increasing independence as well as decreasing risk of injury. When we talk about using a computer, there are some repetitive motor actions that we do, okay? Carpal tunnel is definitely one of them. Okay, so carpal tunnel is something that can arise from the use or misuse of utilizing a keyboard. Okay, among other things, there are different ways you can develop carpal tunnel, as well as other neuromotor diseases, as well as complications with neuromotor access. Okay, so it's really, really important when we talk about utilizing multimodal access. Maybe we need to explore another form of access to maybe alleviate some symptoms that a user is seeing. If they're utilizing their keyboard quite a lot, maybe we can look at a touch-based keyboard. Maybe we can look at using eye gaze with a keyboard. Maybe we can use a switch with a keyboard, an actual keyboard on the screen. So we can explore other ways, other access methods for a user that may be experiencing some sort of symptoms that may result in maybe a lifelong injury. Okay. And also looking at the independence piece, when we're able to give access methods to give a student, give an individual in the workplace, the independence to be able to execute their job functions, that's very, very rewarding. We don't want to, just like us, we wouldn't want to have to rely on somebody else to be able to execute basic functions of life, okay? We want to be able to provide them with as much independence and empower them to, again, do what they once did or never thought possible. Getting back to that Tobii Dynavox phrase. Connectedness with surroundings. We'll explore this a little bit in a couple of slides to come, but looking at environmental control units, okay? You guys have probably heard of ECUs and the importance of looking at environmental control units within folks that have complex access needs, because how they're able to maybe open up their doors or lock their doors or turn on their sinks or be able to obviously turn on the lights in their rooms. We have to explore different ways in which they have connectivity within their surroundings to give them independence, to decrease their level of dependence on their caregivers as well as their support staff. So we want to, by using a certain access method that's very specific to the user that gives them a lot of independence, maybe it not only gives them independence with their communication and their ability to prolong their work life, but also independence in their access with their surroundings, either at home, in the workplace, or in the classroom. So instruction, looking at inclusion, and inclusion is it's obviously a very hot topic. It's always been an important thing, but I think in recent years, looking at inclusion, disability inclusion, workplace accommodation is really, really big right now. And a lot of companies are pushing for that. And I think that that's really, it's a really great rise in our own humanity, as well as looking at a lot of corporations that probably historically neglected to look into these different avenues. But I think that when we look at all the research, all the development that's gone into different access methods for individuals, we can really begin to see this picture of inclusion that is coming from the developments in technology, especially within assistive tech, okay? Because we're really starting to benefit in the assistive technology field from all of the other developments in technology in general. And I will be highlighting this, but I think that this is such an important component because it shouldn't be assistive technology and then looking at the rest of technology. It is looking at all these developments. If we can look at, okay, what is going on with AI? What is going on with Amazon Alexa and Apple Siri, and looking at Google Nest and Google Home and all of these other really great developments in AI, how can we implore the benefits of AI into assistive technology? And then also, how can we look at these amazing different access methods that users with functional impairments use to advanced consumer electronics, which is also something that we're seeing ourselves as a company and also within the assistive technology industry with use of eye tracking. There are so many OEM solutions that are coming out, whether it be eye tracking within motor vehicles and looking at user attention to decrease motor vehicle accidents, looking at eye tracking within the realm of athletics, and looking at training of professional athletes. What is it that one professional athlete that's successful is looking at when they're executing a play? So we might track someone's eyes to see what their attention is saying. What are they attending to? What is something that they are looking at, whether it be a tell that they're looking for in a defender on a basketball court. Okay, so that's something else that we're exploring, and we're taking all of this information and it's improving the lives of users with functional impairments as well as technology in general, which is quite fascinating. So really, we're getting to this place where inclusiveness is really a paramount subject within the realm of technology, whether you have a functional impairment or not. And then looking at increasing participation, productivity, and role longevity. We touched on this just briefly, but assistive technology and alternative access can improve, as been shown. This is research-based, it's evidence-based. We can prolong someone with a functional impairment's ability to execute their role functions. We can improve access for students with disabilities, especially through via remote learning applications. We have worked with hundreds, if not thousands, of college students that need some sort of alternative access method to be able to get into their instruction, to be able to fill out the various forms that come from remote learning. And how much more important is remote learning in this time and day? It has become such a hot topic given the current the current condition of the world. So we're really trying to push for this increasing participation, and then also the longevity of our users and being able to facilitate their work for longer periods of times in the presence of progressive diseases. Okay, so I had said that we would touch on this a little bit. So environmental control units, when we think of environmental control units, ECU is like a term that's like assistive technology, like, oh, we own ECUs, and really we don't. But really ECUs in terms of using environmental control units, this is one of those things in technology that is such a shared feature between users that need to use assistive technology and just your typical consumers. So, we use things like remote controls. Okay. The idea of using a remote control is an environmental control unit. I'm sending an infrared signal or a radio control signal to a receiver. The receiver takes that signal and then it deploys some sort of action onto a UI, onto a user interface. So it could be our television, our smart TV. So we're using a remote control and it does something. Or maybe we're sending a command using our Apple remote to our Apple TV, and then therefore our Apple TV is making changes. Maybe it turns our TV on. Okay, so that in itself is an environmental control unit. We have a transmitter. We're sending a command to a receiver, and then that receiver is doing something with that command. Okay, we don't physically have to be right next to our TV to turn it on. We can use some sort of an environmental control to send a command, and then it does something. So there's lots of different kinds of environmental control units, but I think it's important to look at when we're talking about accessibility to our surroundings, because we use them all the time. Sometimes we use voice control to activate something. So there's lots of different ways in which we can use environmental control units. We have infrared controls. We have radio controls. We also have controls that are built on using some sort of electrical power, and maybe they're battery operated. One of the big things that we do for younger kiddos, Tobii Dynavox, and we're trying to get buy-in. So we talked about student buy-in earlier, is maybe we use an infrared toy, okay? Or you can make a toy that's battery operated, work with an infrared receiver. Okay, so I can take a battery operated a 1AA toy. I can take a little wiring thing that you can get off Amazon or whatever your vendor of choice is, and you can end up hooking in the battery, close the toy, and as long as it's just an on-off function, I can then take our software systems and our hardware that's built in with an infrared transmitter, and I can send a command to that toy to turn on, and then it starts barking. Let's say it's a remote controlled dog, which we've done before. So when we're trying to get student buy-in, especially emerging communicators, when we're trying to get buy-in, we might send a command via using a button on a screen and have the student maybe press that button, or maybe they use eye gaze with the button, or maybe they use a switch to activate the button. And when they do that and you see what happens on their face, all of a sudden something around them turns on or lights up or does something, you immediately see the buy-in of, okay, now the student is recognizing when they access this system, it gives them an independent control of something around them. And that is all this is about. We're trying to improve accessibility for people. Okay, accessibility for children, accessibility for adults, accessibility in the presence of motor function loss, as well as just improving the accessibility of your average consumer. Okay, we're trying to improve access for everybody. Making our environment more accessible is so important, and obviously is very important, is required for folks that can't access it via typical means, whether they can't walk over to the thermostat and change the control. So maybe we need to use some sort of a home feature, a smart home feature, so that they're able to control their thermostat on a computer. And maybe they need to access that computer through an alternative form of access. So you're kind of getting the connection there. So let's talk briefly about Tobii Dynavox and Tobii Group as far as how we stand on accessibility. And I think that this is a really, really important slide when we talked about assistive tech and we talk about technology in general. So Tobii Group encompasses 3 different business units, as said on this slide. So we have Tobii Dynavox, Tobii Pro, and Tobii Tech. You probably didn't know that Tobii Dynavox had 2 other entities that it worked with underneath Tobii. Or maybe you thought Tobii in itself was just one company, and then we all do different things. Okay. Well, actually, Tobii Group encompasses 3 different companies. And those companies are all dedicated, obviously, for in some capacity with eye tracking, but their use of eye tracking has very different, very different applications. And then we take those applications and we bring them back, we research, we develop it to improve all 3 applications. So in this way, we can take, for instance, Tobii Dynavox, the part of the company that I work for. We work specifically with assistive technology in incorporating access methods like eye gaze to improve the communication and the technological access of individuals with motor impairments. But we also pair up and we use the same shared eye tracking research with Tobii Pro. And Tobii Pro looks at consumer electronics. Maybe they look at incorporating eye tracking, like we had said, with professional athletes. Maybe they look at military applications for training. How do we train a pilot to what to look at when they're airborne, or when they have to get into evasive maneuvers? Or how do we go about looking at advertising? And what exactly, when an individual looks at an advertisement, what is it? What colors are within an advertisement that gets human attention? Okay, because looking at and understanding human behavior is super important when we talk about eye gaze. Because what we know here at Tobii Dynavox and at Tobii Group is that we believe very strongly through our research that what the eyes are looking at is a good determination of what human beings are thinking. And although we'll get into this more in a little bit when we do a little bit of the application of eye tracking, I want you to think about this scenario for a second. So the majority of human beings use a refrigerator to keep their foods from spoiling. So think about your refrigerator and think about a carton of milk. Okay, so you open up your refrigerator, and the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to look for your carton of milk, if that was indeed the reason for why you went over to your fridge. Okay, so you open up your refrigerator, you look for your carton of milk. That's the first thing you do. Okay, we are visual communicators. We use visual acuity to be able to lock in and determine where something is in our space. Okay, it helps us to keep separation from other human beings, other people, when we're in crowded spaces. And it also allows us to be able to make a determination of, when we're driving a car, what route to go, what lane to be in. We use our visual acuity, our visual communication, to be able to look and interact with our surroundings. So when we look at eye gaze and we look at eye tracking, when you open up your refrigerator, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to look for your carton of milk. Then the second thing you're going to do is you're going to complete an action. If your action is to clean out your fridge, maybe you need to look at your carton of milk. I need to grab my carton of milk, and then I'm going to put that into my refuse. Okay, I'm going to put that into my garbage can. Okay, so maybe the reason for the action is to just find the carton of milk because I need to pour myself a glass. So first I'm going to look for my carton of milk, then I'm going to complete an action. I'm going to grab the carton of milk and take it out of the fridge. That is how human behavior works. So if we can think of maybe a user can't physically ambulate to grab milk, but if they want milk and they look at it, that's a good determination of maybe what they want to do something with the carton of milk, right? So then it goes into, we need to interpret when they look at something in different environments, what is it that they want to do with it? Or maybe we need to design a software where they look at the carton of milk, but they can't ambulate towards it because this is a user that has complex access needs. And maybe they can't ambulate. So they look at the carton of milk. Maybe I need to, okay, after they've selected it, I need to give them another menu of, okay, you've looked at the carton of milk. What do you want to do with it? Do you want to move it? Do you want to pull it out of the fridge? Do you want to pour it out on the floor? Probably not. But again, these are all different actions that maybe they want to be able to execute. Okay, so we need to be able to provide them with those actions. And then when we get down to Tobii Tech, okay, Tobii Tech looks at OEM integration. And when we talked about the shared relationship now, looking at inclusivity between technology and assistive technology and the entire technology landscape, we now are using our eye tracking into gaming solutions. So now the latest video games that are coming out, maybe instead of when you're using a controller, if there's any gamers that are listening here, if you're using a controller and you're locking onto a target in like a first-person shooter game, maybe instead of me having to move my joysticks to be able to lock onto an opponent, I just have to look at them. Because just by looking, that's the best determination of what it is I want to do. So now we're seeing this paradigm shift of we're improving our accessibility in the gaming industry. We're improving our accessibility in our environmental our environmental controls and our environment in general around us. So we're looking at this entire landscape of inclusivity with assistive technology. And I just wanted to be able to at least show that there's this relationship between all three of these divisions. And by us looking at when the gaming community designs something, we can take that research and we can take it and we can maybe deploy it into our assistive technology. Or we might take something from our assistive technology that we learned about human behavior and we use that to look into why exactly a hockey player attends to something for a certain period of seconds. Okay, maybe it's because we as a human beings need a certain amount of time to attend to a target before we can make a selection. So there's a lot going on here, but at least I wanted to show that relationship. Okay, so let's think about multimodal access for a second. So let's take a step back and I want you to think about your computer in front of you. Maybe you're accessing this through use of an iPad. Maybe you're using a desktop, maybe you're using a laptop. So different types of computers, different types of systems, computer systems. So we use a mouse to operate a computer in general. That's typically true. Unless we're using maybe a non-PC system, we would use some sort of a mouse. All right. And especially if you're thinking about your workplace. So I want you to really focus on your workplace or really focus on having to work on a project where we would need to use a keyboard. Okay. So I want you to think about utilizing a mouse and what other ways can we access systems? If you were listening, I actually just said one of them. Okay. So what other ways do we access computer systems? I want you to think about this and write it in the chat for me. I'll give you about 2 minutes on this. So I really want you to think about your response. What are all the different ways that you access a system?
So they're starting to roll in here, Charles. Got touch screen, voice, keyboard, voice activated, touchpad, sight. Gestures.
Keep them coming.
Lots of votes for the keyboard and touchpad. You can tell that we've been marketed by. Audio. Lauren is suggesting audio.
Mm-hmm.
And I apologize for everyone. Lorna sent that message directly to me as the host. It didn't come out to everybody, but Jim has added switches. And okay. Keyboard, Thomas is summarizing here for us: keyboard, voice, vision, hands, feet, and alternative input devices. And any Bluetooth inputs like joysticks, etc. from Colin. Thanks, Colin. Good to see you here, Colin. Colin's with one of our assessment centers here in the local London area, Thames Valley Children's Center.
Fantastic. Okay, so that's been about 2 minutes.
And Thomas slid the last one in there, monitors.
Sure, that's a great one too. That's a great one too, Thomas. So when we think about this, and again, you guys had said things that are much more than what I have written here. But the important thing here is, so we, even as folks that are using these computerized systems in our everyday interactions with them, we use, I mean, if you think about all the different ways that you access a computerized system just throughout one day, maybe 1 hour, you think of all the different forms of access that you're using to operate that computer. So it begs the question, this is not such a strange concept to using multimodal access. It just looks different, right? And this is something that I really try to. And for assistive technologists, obviously this isn't strange to you, because this is something that we work with all the time. But when we're talking about our funding organizations, when we're talking about the companies that we work with, this is something that we try to really bring home, because we use, I mean, if I were to say the only way that you can access a system is with use of your mouse, good luck. Because there's lots of different ways that you access your system. And for users that have complex access needs, we just have to change exactly what that access method is. They're still using multimodal access. Multimodal access is just our assistive technology fancy term for using more than one way to access a computer. But obviously from this slide here, we use lots of different ways. We access a computer probably in many more ways than even users that incorporate 3 or 4 different access methods to be able to operate a system. And I think that that's just a really important that's a really important consideration to share when sometimes we're faced with rebuttals of, maybe this system is too expensive, or maybe we need to, they already have this access method, so they should be good to go. We really need to think about the person. We need to think about the entire solution. And trying to bring up ways that, and sometimes it can be quite contrived, especially to someone that isn't familiar with our industry, right? Whether it be, sometimes we have to meet with human resource teams, and we have to provide them with some education when they're working on a reasonable accommodation for a workplace solution. And when we meet with them, we talk about this. We talk about, okay, well, which ways do you access your systems? And you start to see that wide eye effect, like, oh, I actually access this in many different ways. And here I am trying to tell an individual, when I'm working on their solution, their form of access method that I'm trying, their form of access that I'm trying to provide, the solution, this comprehensive solution, I'm trying to limit that. And really, we want to try and provide as many different ways that an individual can interact with their computer interface. Okay. So thank you for completing that exercise here. Okay, so at this time, I'm going to go into a little bit of computer control, which is one of our forms of desktop access softwares, where we're going to talk a little bit about eye gaze. Later on, as soon as we get through a couple of these slides, I'm actually going to do a little bit of demo so you can see what this looks like in action. But I just want to go over this concept, the concept of this program. Okay, so computer control is a type of program that is offered at Tobii Dynavox, and it works with eye tracking. And the reason for why I wanted to bring this up to you all is, when we were talking about interaction and having a user be able to attend to something and then make a selection, that's what our research suggests. It's super important that a user is able to see something and then they're able to make an action on it. But that's not always, when we're designing these technology solutions for folks, that's not always where we start. And so I think it's important to explore where we started and where we are now, And I'm going to do that by just briefly going over computer control, which is one of our desktop softwares. Okay, so computer control is a software application that allows a user with complex access needs that is utilizing eye gaze to be able to get onto a system and be able to have increased speed, accuracy, as well as reduce maybe their fatigue and anxiety, as well as a number of repeated failures. One of the big things with eye tracking in general, and this has been a thing of the past, matter of fact, Doug and I had chatted about this several weeks ago, is eye tracking in itself has always been thought to be, I think about it in terms of cell phones. Okay. So if we go back technology, go back, let's say 20 years in technology, and we look at phones in general. I mean, I'm still part of the generation that remembers that I had phone numbers that I would keep for my friends, and I would call my friend's number. And if they weren't available, it was their home phone, their landline. So if they weren't available, they couldn't be reached. And I think that's amazing because we're no longer, obviously we're far removed from that day of that day and age. And now we have all this connectivity. And when we look at phones, I mean, it used to be, maybe 20 years ago that when folks would be using like a car phone, okay, dare I say, that was a very unique thing to see. That was not something that was really that a lot of the population had. It had a very high cost associated with it. And now what we've been able to see with eye tracking, and something that Tobii Dynavox as a whole has been really trying to push, is trying to get eye tracking to a place where we reduce the financial burden on families, on funding sources, especially particular in Canada, where we have some funding that is quite difficult to be accessed. Okay, or maybe the funding organizations that we have within either at the provincial level or at the national level only have certain cost limits. So it reduces our ability to look at eye tracking as a direct access method or as a supplemental access method when we talk about multimodal access. Okay, so looking at where eye tracking is now, we have really came a long way, and I'm going to share with you towards the end of this presentation just how far as from a financial standpoint, the burden of eye tracking and looking at different access methods on families. Okay, as well as on other organizations that have to look at eye tracking as a form of access, either at the university level, for school districts, things like that. So when we talked about earlier about how we would have, human attention, when we go to complete an action, we're looking at something and then we determine what action we want to do. So we really have came a long way with this, and the fact that if you look down here towards the bottom of my screen, if any of you have exposure to our earlier eye tracking software, you probably remember this. And this is very, very similar, regardless if you look at Tobii Dynavox software with desktop solutions, or if you look at any of our competitors, having this eye gaze bar, as it's been commonly referred to as, with these list of actions was very, very popular in earlier developing desktop control. And that's really been a system that's kind of been the staple of using eye tracking. And I can tell you from the last 5 to 6 years, remember the Tobii Tech, Tobii Pro, Tobii Dynavox, in our research together as a unit, we've been able to determine that that's not actually how human attention works. And we've been able to look at our other divisions and see how human attention works. And we have come up with a term called interaction first, which is actually how our human behavior works. Go back to the carton milk example. Okay, we look at something and then we determine what we want to do with it. And so we have changed the way that desktop access is formatted, in the fact that we now have this gaze trace bubble, okay, that can move around a desktop screen for a user. So it's important, if we think about kiddos don't know mouse commands. I mean, the majority of the younger population that's coming up is so used to using touchscreens that the idea of what a left click or double left click does is very contrived. Okay, so it's important that we come up with a way to access a computer that really encompasses the full life spectrum, whether it be users that have been using a computer for a very, very long time, or whether it be an emerging communicator that's never had interaction access, never been able to access a screen. Okay, so we need to look at across the life spectrum and look at in terms of familiarity with using mouse commands. So what this gaze trace does is it provides biofeedback, so that even an emerging kiddo, or maybe maybe an older individual that hasn't really delved too much into technology, it's important for them to see that by looking at the screen, when I move my eyes around, I'm seeing something happen. It gives me the feedback to know that, okay, I'm looking in the top right-hand corner of my screen, I have this bubble there. And if I look down to the bottom left-hand corner, that bubble moves with my gaze. That's super important because they're beginning to see that their attention to where they are on the screen can manipulate and make changes to it. Okay. So we've moved to this interaction first style of access. And now we have these radial menus. So before, what would happen, I'm just going to go up briefly through my slides. If we look down at this bottom image, how things used to work for desktop control. And this is a Tobii Dynavox software, so I get to make fun of it. Okay. So how this would work is we would have a user, and let's say they wanted to select their recycling bin in the top left-hand corner. And again, this is a small image, so I do apologize for that. I will showcase this when I go to share my screen. But if we look at this recycling bin, if a user wanted to make a selection, oftentimes what would happen is their attention would go to the recycling bin. They would go, okay, I need to do a double left click to be able to select this recycling bin. So they move their gaze towards the recycling bin, then they come all the way back across the entire screen real estate. They peer at this double click icon, the action selects, then they move that action, they go back across the entire screen real estate, and then they put that action onto where they want to interact, and then it executes the action. Silliness, folks, silliness. Okay, so what we needed to do was we needed to have the research to see what does human attention do when you look at a screen. Okay, we look at something, and then while we're looking at it, we want to complete an action. Think about using your mouse. If I look at my recycling bin, I then move my mouse to it, and then I double click it. Okay, so I looked at it, and then I completed an action to that interaction. Okay. So now we have these radial menus. So now after I select my recycling bin, you can see here, this is your chosen target. So imagine this being the recycling bin. I've looked at it. Then the program goes, okay, Charles, you've looked at this. You want to do something with it. So going back to that earlier example of, we know that by having a user look at something, it's a good interpretation of what they want to do. It's a good interpretation that they want to do something. Okay. So now we're getting to that second stage. They've looked at it. Okay, here are your options. What do you want to do? Do you want to double left click it? Do you want to single left click it? Maybe if you had a web page open, do you want to scroll so you can read what the web page says? And we'll get into a little bit more of this, but this is how this program is structured. And it's based on that research component of how does our attention work when we're using some sort of a computerized user interface, like using the desktop, or if we're using a web browser, or think about using like many folks that are in the working force use different CRM systems like Salesforce or Oracle, and they have to be able to access Oracle and Salesforce by using mouse commands. So now we're able to give them those mouse commands, and they just essentially look at what they did before when they would move their mouse to it, and this menu comes up, and they can select, they can execute their mouse commands. Okay, so it's quite intuitive, and it's pretty easy to understand the concept. It's the exact way that we actually work with our motor commands with our mouse. So it's important with this that a software also encompasses training, and this is something that Doug and I really touched on, because as far as Tobii Dynavox goes, we are anti-salesy. We are very education based. Okay, so we have to, in every single part of our software, we strive very, very hard to incorporate methods of learning. Okay, and learning is an institution within our programs. So every single off-screen menu, every single menu change has the ability to show a user exactly what different actions do, and that is always accessible to them. Okay, so I have this little information guide button, which I will be able to showcase for you all. But when I look at this information button, it shows this quick start guide that makes this menu non-accessible. And the reason for that is because I want to have a user be able to spend time reading exactly what these different actions, what these different buttons do. I don't want them to be able to, when they first start learning this program, everything they look at is accessible. That doesn't incorporate principles of training, because I don't want everything to be accessible right away. I want the individual to learn what these actions do and then be able to facilitate those actions when they're needed. Okay, so menus, all the different kinds of menus that are available in computer control incorporate these quick start guides, so that if all of a sudden you get to a different, you get to a menu that looks different, like this one, or there's also some other menus that are available like this one, for example. This menu, I've already looked at the quick start guide, and it gives me what exactly these different actions do. okay? So we want to have those menus available. So if all of a sudden something looks different for a user, maybe they get to an area of the program they haven't seen before, we can quickly provide them with a guide of, okay, you've gotten here. This is exactly what you can do when you reach this menu. Okay, so at this time, and I had already informed Doug about this, I'm going to go ahead and turn off my camera briefly, and I'm going to jump out into the desktop. I'm going to get my camera, my eye gaze camera hooked up, and I'll do a short little demo of exactly how this computer control works in terms of eye gaze. Okay, so Doug, at this time, if there's any questions that we want to revisit, we can do that at this time.
Yeah, there's not been any questions added into the chat yet, but I do want to remind people to please add your questions, thoughts, comments into the chat. If you are preferring to wait until the formal question period at the end of our presentation, then by all means, we can at that point unmute yourself and ask the question by voice. But definitely keep in mind to add your thoughts and questions into the chat as we go. And just a reminder, while Charles is getting set up there, any NOAT members that are with us today that would like to stick around afterwards, there will be a breakout room opening up at the end for our after party discussion, socialization times. So. I know that Charles did share with me that it takes a little bit to change over. So this is the time we need a commercial break. I guess the real question begs to be asked here is how many people are up, have gotten up during the webinar to get a glass of milk every time Charles has said something. I just got a note from Charles that I guess he somehow got muted there. You should be unmuted now.
Yeah, I was working as a participant and I was unable to unmute myself, so I do apologize for that.
Perfect. It's partly my fault too. Sorry about that, Charles. So
no worries at all.
All right. So everybody's back from the fridge now. All right.
Okay. So folks, we're gonna jump out. I'm gonna jump out to the desktop. I'm gonna continue to share my screen, and that way you folks are able to see exactly how this computer control works with the desktop. So at this time, you can see my desktop, and I'm gonna open up an icon called Computer Control. And I'm going to just go ahead and have this. So now you're able to see this bubble, this opaque bubble that's moving across my screen. So that's my gaze. Just so that you can see that I'm not cheating, I have my hands up here, so I'm not doing anything with my hands during this part of the presentation. Okay, so I'm moving the gaze around, and just
we're not seeing your camera, Charles. I don't believe that your hands aren't doing this.
Okay. Okay. Well, you'll just have to take my word for it.
Okay.
Unfortunately. Okay. Fair enough. But so you're able to see this bubble move across the screen. Okay. And when I peer at something, like if I were to look at Google Chrome here, I've stopped, and now I've moved Google Chrome to the center of the screen. And now you can see that I pulled up my quick start guide, and now it says, okay, Charles, you've looked at Google Chrome. Now you want to do something with it. So you can see that if you had a student that was utilizing desktop and needed to use some sort of multimodal access, we can always incorporate eye tracking in addition to your standard mouse commands and the use of a keyboard. Here you can see on the bottom right hand side, I have a keyboard that's available, but I'm going to execute a couple of these different actions so you can see exactly how they work kind of in real time. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and hide my guide, looking at the hide guide button, and it says, okay, Charles, what do you want to do? I'm going to do a double left-hand click, and I'm going to open up Google Chrome. So from here, I already have some different menus that are available to me that I can look through. And maybe I want to pull up Tobii Dynavox here. I've looked at Tobii Dynavox. I only have to do a single left click to be able to open up my shortcuts. So I'm going to go ahead and open this up. From here, I can't see this entire screen. So I might need to use my scroll feature. I can look into the center of the page, and maybe I don't know where the scroll feature is. I can go to my guide, and okay, scroll is the very top button that's available. Okay, great. I'm going to go ahead and hide my guide now. I'm going to look at scroll. And here you can see here, this yellow array is where my gaze is looking. The further away I look from that bubble, the faster it goes. Okay. The closer I am to the bubble, the slower it is. So you imagine if I were to just be reading, for instance, underneath this I-110 menu that I am looking at right now, I have this an ultra durable touchscreen speech generating device. Okay, so if I was reading that slowly, you're going to see this, the scroll feature start to scroll slowly because I'm reading and I'm very, very slowly moving away from where I planted that scroll on the page. So you can see how that would work really, really well, even if you had a student that was using some sort of an online, they were operating the online syllabus and they had different actions that they were completing. It's really, really it's really, really important to incorporate the different features that you'd be using on a web browser. Okay. Likewise, if I wanted to be able to type and search something, okay, so now I'm ready to exit. You can see this exit icon to the right-hand side that I keep highlighting and looking off of. So I'm going to look at this X icon. And maybe I want to go ahead and look at something else. Okay, so I maybe look at my bar here, and I'm just going to do a click in here, and I'm gonna pull up my keyboard. Okay, so I've got my keyboard here, and I'm gonna go ahead and maybe I want to pull up a different form of communication here. Or maybe I actually just want to backspace this. Okay, so actually I'm gonna look up here, populate this. Actually, I could do a hold and drag too. Let's do that. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and backspace this. Okay, left an H that was sticking in there. Okay, so now I've removed everything from here. Maybe I want to type in YouTube. Okay, so you can see YouTube's already populated there, but maybe, you know, because this user is not used to using this on-screen keyboard, maybe this keyboard's too small, or maybe it's too large. So maybe I need to come down here and I need to look at this other menu that's available. You could see there when I looked off of the screen, I pulled up this separate menu. That is the case throughout computer control. When a user is looking below their screen, it pulls the other menu actions that are available, whatever they're accessing, whether they're accessing the keyboard, whether they've made a selection using that interaction bubble where they have the different actions in that radial array. And this gives them the ability to change the language of the keyboard, maybe to switch where the keyboard is located. Maybe this keyboard, because it's located at the bottom of my screen, is blocking something that I want to be able to access with my mouse. Likewise, maybe I need to change the size of my keyboard, okay? And I can quickly do that. I can look at this sizing, and now I have an enormous keyboard, okay? It's taking up half my screen, but it gives me just, maybe I need a little bit more access, or as my day goes on, I get a little bit wore out, okay? So maybe I need to look down here, and I need to go to that medium-sized keyboard, or likewise, I have 3 different options. I can go to the smallest one, okay? Getting to where I was moving the location of the keyboard, I can move it to the top of the screen if I want. And that gives me access to locate and make access options towards the bottom of my desktop screen. Okay. And then likewise, I can also just exit out of here. Okay. So I've got YouTube available here, and I'm just going to look at YouTube. Okay. And from here, I could do a single left-hand click, and then I could go to YouTube if I wanted to. So you're kind of getting the idea of how mouse commands kind of work. But let's look at some other functionality. Okay. So let's look at, I'm going to exit out of this, and let's just minimize this. Okay. Let's say I'm going to actually do something else. So let's say I was trying to minimize this, but I'm teaching a user, and maybe they're not used to using this. Okay. They're not used to using this. This is all contrived. We're not used to operating something with our eyes. We're used to looking at something and then completing some sort of a command. Usually we ambulate, we move our hands, or maybe we walk over to the target. Okay. But now in this case, I'm pairing a motor command, okay, with my gaze. So this is all very contrived. There's a lot of learning going on here. So here in this program, you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, I have something called adjust target. And this is super important because as learners, we make mistakes. And in eye gaze, we need to incorporate that learning component. Again, I had said before, learning is an institution. We think of learning as an institution at Tobii Dynavox. So we always incorporate this. So that adjust target feature is there to help train a user, to help them be able to be more independent. If they're having trouble accessing something, maybe it's because of limitation with their positioning, which we'll talk about in a second. But maybe we need to give them that second chance, second opportunity to be able to get their target. So even after I've pulled up this gaze bubble, and this is what I've had selected, but I was really trying to hit the minimize button, maybe I just need to specify where that target is in that bubble. So I can hide this guide, look at my adjust target, and oh, actually, that's what I wanted. So I just moved my target where I wanted it, and then I'm going to go ahead and make my single left-hand click, and I just minimize my screen. So you can see that it's fairly intuitive, and it also incorporates a high level of success. So even if a user is unsuccessful in their first opportunity to access a target, they can still be very accessible and not have to reselect the interaction on the screen. Okay, they can just adjust their target to have it fit more accurately with what they were wanting to do. Here, I've got this math games here, and I want to showcase being able to move a target around a screen. Okay, and this would be important if you think about a lot of times UI interface, computer user interfaces, whether it be a Salesforce CRM, Oracle, or even like I'm thinking of the type of interface that a lot of universities use, Blackboard. Okay, I think that's it. So a lot of universities incorporate something called Blackboard. It's a learning tool. It's a user interface. So sometimes you have to move, whether it be a multiple choice matchmaking on a quiz, if you think about, you have to be able to move a target with your eyes. And that could be quite challenging when we're not using the typical mouse and moving a selection. So here we have something. I'm going to look at my information guide. This click and drag, which is exactly what it says. It's fairly intuitive. That doesn't leave a whole lot up to guess there. So if I hide the guide here, I've selected my mouth games. I want to move that around my desktop. I can hold this click and drag. Okay, Charles, where do you want to move this? Let's move it right here. And more specifically, maybe I'm working in Excel and I need to determine what cell the information needed to go in. Yes, right here's where I wanted it. Okay, boom, that's exactly where it moves that target. So I think we're sort of painting the picture here of when you're incorporating eye gaze, just how specific you can get with moving a target on a screen. It's not like it was before, where you had that gaze bar along the right-hand side, and I went all the way across the screen, then I went all the way back here to make my action, then put my action on the target. We're not doing that at all anymore. Now, all we are doing is we're interacting with our screen, and then the software goes, okay, you've looked at something. What do you want to do? Okay, and that is much more in line with how human behavior works. Okay, now you might be thinking, okay, how does this work when we are getting a user ready to go with eye tracking? And I think that's really, really important point. So what I did there is I just pulled off the on-screen menu, our settings, and I'm looking at our interaction. I can go ahead and close this because I want to go back here and I want to show you this menu with a quick guide. Okay, so that guide button is there again. So I have a calibrate, I have my general settings, as well as maybe I want to put the computer to sleep. I can do that. As well as copy, cut, and paste features, because those are really, really important when we're utilizing eye gaze. We still want to be able to do our mouse features like right-clicking and highlighting text and copying and pasting things, okay, which we want to do with users too. So if I hide my guide here and I look at calibrate, you see here at the very bottom menu that I have this something that we call your gaze calibrations, your gaze interaction status. Okay, so here, these two dots you see are my eyes. So you can see that I can move them around quite a bit. You can't see my camera, but I'm actually moving quite a bit. And then you see along the right-hand side, I have this arrow, and that's my distance. So as I go away, that arrow falls down. As well as I get away from my computer, my voice probably becomes more distant. And if I get a lot closer, you can see that the arrow moves up. Okay, so we give this little visual indication for caregivers when we're training caregivers to on positioning with eye tracking, because regardless if you have a user that's using switch access or using eye gaze access, we need to work on positioning. Okay, we need to ensure that we do lots of training with positioning, and even for individuals that are supported in their workplace, if they have support personnel to help them to get to a position where their eye gaze is going to be functional for them. So here we have this nice little calibration box. I can pull that up anytime I want and see what my positioning is. What's super important is that not only do we have this, we have about 80 to 100 different profiles, different eyes that we have tracked to make a general eye tracking calibration that can be used by the majority of the population. And the reason for why we did that is if I look at these different actions, this calibrate action or this close action, I'm not moving my mouse. I'm just looking at it and it's doing it with my eyes. Okay. So we wanted to make even our setup accessible to an eye gaze user that has not yet been calibrated with this system. So from the very get-go, as long as I pull up this little that little eye gaze box, that calibration box, from the very get-go, as long as that user's eyes are in the center of this screen and they are positionally pretty darn good. Even if they're in the yellow, that's okay. They're going to be able to go through their settings setup on their own, independently. They don't need anybody else to help them set up their eye gaze. They can do that themselves. And I'm going to prove that to you. So if I close this, okay, I've just set up a user who's going to be using some sort of eye gaze. I can go to my settings, and all of these actions, if I look over, they're all accessible using my eyes. I'm not using, I promise you can see my mouse on the screen, I believe. I'm not moving my mouse at all. I'm just using my eyes. I can open up my activation settings using my eyes, and I can select all of these just using eye gaze. All of this is accessible. If I'm using eye gaze plus a switch, which would be the case if I was using eye gaze, let's say with a mouse. So maybe I'm going to, maybe I have a user, this is a really great example for a user that needs a mix of multimodal access, but uses a touchpad. So maybe due to their condition, it is very difficult for them to move a mouse around, but they're still able to use a left and right click. So in this case, we could incorporate the use of gaze to move their switch, and then they can still use their left and right click on their touchpad to be able to make selections. So it's important that we don't just have to access things using gaze interaction. We can actually use a switch plus gaze to have a custom solution, okay? And here's where we can also change dwell time fixation. I won't get into all of this. If you have questions about this after this presentation, Doug has my contact information that he'll be providing to you so that we can go into this in more detail if you do have questions, okay? It's also important to note that here we have underneath the trace, we're still in activation settings. Under the trace, you see that I have my target set to very opaque. It's really, really important for biofeedback when you're training eye gaze to have your target be very opaque, being very visible, because even for adult users that are very familiar with mouse commands, they're not familiar with executing mouse commands with their eyes. Okay, so we need to provide a target, we need to provide biofeedback that is very visible so that they're able to see, okay, this is how this works. I can see where my gaze is going on the screen when I make selections, okay? I'm going to go back here and I'm going to go back to calibration. So when we're setting up a user, maybe a user only is able to track in one eye due to some underlying impairment. Maybe they don't have function with one eye. Maybe they only have function with just the one. So maybe we need to track with just the left or just the right eye, and we can do that. When we're doing a calibration, it's super important positioning. We've already talked about that, but incorporating positioning in our training, not only to the user, but to everybody that's supporting them. Getting into keyboard, not going into this to a lot of detail. What I did want to showcase here is you see here under buttons, under the second category here, that I have dwell time. Now, this is a development and something we've seen across our industry in that we want to separate accessing keyboard buttons to accessing the other buttons on the screen. You guys remember when I pulled up that radial menu when I selected Google Chrome, okay, and I had those radial buttons that were available to me? Having the amount of activation time, the dwell time that is needed for me to access those buttons, I might want to set up very differently than when I have a user that has a QWERTY keyboard in front of them. And if you think about that, that makes a lot of sense. Maybe I'm not familiar with how to use this program, but I'm really familiar with how a keyboard is laid out. So maybe I want to have the dwell time for selecting a button on a keyboard be a lot less than that of selecting an action for mouse commands. So you can see how there's good reason to separate those, which is why that even in the keyboard settings, keyboard has its own dwell time versus the dwell time for the entire program, which was the case in previous iterations of desktop control. Okay. Here also, maybe we want to have we have word prediction on our keyboard. So maybe we want to have the word prediction take longer to be able to be selected because the user has to read what the words are. So maybe I want to have, even within the keyboard, separate the dwell time for using the word prediction different than using the actual keyboard keys. Okay, and that's okay. We might want to separate those. So again, we're providing lots of different options here because those are really, really needed for our users to be successful with eye tracking. If I look over here at the other additional settings here, if I look at mode and I go to open mode, when I talked earlier about how we have emerging communicators and we have communicators that have been using, maybe Windows interface for a very long time, more of our adult-based users, or maybe some of our kiddos that are familiar with desktop systems. Here you have this category called continuous mode. And what this is this is a mode that's really built for emerging kiddos. or emerging communicators, not just kiddos, just emerging communicators that are not used to using desktop access. Maybe we want to start them here. So here you have, I have two different modes. I have an advanced and simplified. So I'll start with simplified. And then I want computer control to start in continuous mode on startup. So every single time that we open up computer control, it's going to start in this simple form. Because we don't want to get into all the advanced actions and keyboards and scrolling and click and drag. We don't want to give all of those different commands because it's overwhelming. Maybe I just want to do something that's referred to as a left sticky click. Okay, so a left sticky click is a click that I don't have to continue to reselect the action that I want the mouse to do. I just have this bubble that moves around, and the only thing it does is a left click. And if you have some knowledge of using sticky click, you might be familiar with some applications of using a sticky click. If you're unfamiliar with it, I'm going to showcase it right now. Okay, so if you think about a younger kiddo or younger person, or even an emerging communicator, it could be an adult as well, that's using eye gaze in continuous mode, I'm going to actually go and show you the about menu. There really is nothing really in the general settings other than your version. And then also this one thing is this auto launch. Here, I just cheated. I just showed you with my mouse, but I think it's important for the presentation. So auto launch just fires up the program with Windows. It's like it makes it a Windows startup program, which may be really important for users because if their system all of a sudden restarts or has all these Windows updates, as Microsoft loves to do to us, we want their access method, their form of access, to maybe auto launch all the time. So that way they're not without access. Okay. So that's the only thing I wanted to show you there. Now I'll get into continuous mode. Okay. So if we think about a kiddo, emerging communicator, I'm going to jump into something called continuous mode. And now you just see this dot kind of moving around the screen. Okay. I'm just going to look at math games here. And I'm looking. And what you can't see is I'm actually executing a left click, and I'm going to go ahead and maybe select my left click. That would help, Charles. Okay, so I'm gonna look at math games here. Oh, you just saw that bubble just shrunk. Okay, so I just executed a single left click. Now, you guys are familiar with using a desktop. If I look at a desktop shortcut and do a single left-hand click, it's not gonna do anything. Okay, you need to do a double left-hand click to open a program. Okay, but if you think about this in terms of using like an emerging communication program like a Look to Learn or a Look to Read that are both offered by our competitor Smartbox, which are great programs. There's also some really great free programs that are available online for even teaching an emerging, someone that's emerging in use of eye tracking. A really, really great one is called Eye Gaze Games, which I'm going to show you now. That is available. This is a website that was literally designed by assistive technology folks in the AT industry. If I go to my settings here, you can see that they have eye gaze mode. They have switch plus keyboard. They have everything from dwell time to animation to whether or not to repeat a command. If you're using single switch or maybe we need to map the two different switches into different keyboard commands. So this is obviously from the AT industry. This is super cool. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you if I was using an emerging user with eye gaze and unfamiliar, just using a left sticky click. Remember, it doesn't pull up that radial menu. It just does that left click all the time. What does that do? So if I go back here, just using that single left-hand click, I can look at iDrive, for example, the game, and it's going to obviously select it because I'm doing a left-hand click. I want to launch it. Bet you guys didn't think you'd be coming here to watch me fly a spaceship, but nonetheless, that's what we're doing. Okay, so I'm going to look here at quick game here. We're just going to do a little time trial, and I'm not going to do the entire thing, but I'm just going to show you what this looks like. Again, all I'm using is my gaze. And we talk about how we have a company called Tobii Tech, and Tobii Tech works with gamers and what exactly they're looking at on the screen. This is a great development and use case. All I'm doing is looking ahead of the spaceship with my eyes. And if I had a user that wasn't used to using eye tracking, they would have no idea of how to fly this. But as soon as they start, playing the game and seeing how their interaction works, they can begin to determine, okay, when I use my eyes, it makes changes to the screen. It might make changes to the game that I'm playing. Okay, if I look down here at the pause menu, it starts to slow down my spaceship, and then I can look ahead. So I'm not going to keep playing that game, as fun as that might be, but just showing you that we can really simplify the computer control to be able to be used with emerging communicators. Again, if I look at different things, this would be much more guided access. I'm still going to be pulling up different applications for the user. I'm going to be training them on the fact that sort of that cause effect. So when I do something, something happens on the screen. That response to stimuli. I'm looking at something and therefore it's going to make an action. If we think about visual scenes are a really great thing to do. So I could hide 6 pictures on my screen. And maybe when the user looks at the picture, all of a sudden it turns from dark to all of a sudden it highlights or it animates. So that's the same thing that we did when we had IR, when we had an infrared switch that we pulled up. And we were able to animate a toy. So they're able to see by looking at something, they get a response. And that's super important for emerging communicators and emerging access users that need that response to stimuli, that cause effect, a cause effect style of information coming back to them. Okay, so I'm going to at this time I'm going to pull the presentation back up here. And I'm going to go ahead and exit out of computer control. Hopefully that was a nice little demo for you folks. And I'm going to strongly encourage you, if you have not before, you can go to a website called mytobiidynavox.com. And you can log in, create an account there. And what we'll do is we'll actually provide free access to a lot of the software that we have. So it's completely free. We don't spam you or anything like that, but you can create a My Tobii Dynavox account and actually be able to explore some of the software and some of at least the training that we provide. I also encourage you to explore something called the Tobii Dynavox Learning Hub, which has all sorts of free training. You can use your My Tobii Dynavox. It's all single sign-on login. You can use your My Tobii Dynavox account to log into the Learning Hub. We have training on switch access, training on multi-modal access, eye gaze, although we're incorporating Tobii Dynavox solutions, obviously, but the actual training itself is applicable to all our competitors' products as well. And in the AT industry, we have sort of this very love relationship with all of our competitors. We all work because we all work together, because we provide solutions with people with complex access needs. So it's a kind of a big family. We all work very closely together. And Tobii Dynavox in itself, we try to be as ethical as we can, and we want to always provide. Maybe we know for a fact that our solutions aren't always the best for clients, and we would be doing a disservice to clients if we were to ever be the ones recommending our devices. We always leave it to the clinical professionals to make determinations. We're just here to support you in the training that we provide you, as well as the support and resources we provide to families, clients, students, and the actual users themselves. Okay, so I'm going to invite you all to, if you have any questions about the presentation, this is a great time to have some Q&A. I think that we have right around 10 minutes to be able to discuss this, and feel free, Doug, to take over as far as the moderation goes.
Perfect. Thank you, Charles. Quite a lot of information there to take in, and we have had some questions come into the chat throughout. First up, I'll relay Colin's question, and he thinks that you might have answered this, but I'm going to put it to you, Charles, just to comment on it so that we make sure that Colin gets the complete answer in that. He's asking, are you able to hide the gaze trace when using computer control inside games and web browsing? Specifically because sometimes it's distracting for some of his clients.
Absolutely, Colin. That's a good question. So, and again, so we had made, just for the sake of this presentation, I had made that gaze bubble very opaque. And I had made it very, very dark. Okay, but you can change how translucent that gaze bubble is, all the way to almost invisible, to where you can't see the gaze bubble at all on the screen. So yeah, that's a great question, and you certainly can do that.
Perfect. Thank you, Charles. And just remind anybody that wants to ask their questions by voice, please unmute your microphones. I'm keeping an eye on those. And if I see any unmuted microphones, we'll call on you as soon as possible. For others, just continue to add your questions or comments or thoughts into the chat. And as Thomas just did. Thank you, Thomas. Jim is said that he has a Tobii C4. Will the eye software you're going to show work with it? I find it doesn't track too accurately.
So that's a good question. So we have different generations of eye tracking, right? So when you come up with whether it be a processor that's being developed or whether that be a type of GPU, a graphics processing unit that's being developed, you have lots of years of innovation here. Okay, so before we had, I believe with the C series device, you had it was like a TIS 15 or something like that form of eye tracking, Tobii eye tracking that was employed in that system. And we've gone through probably 2 or 3 developmental changes with our hardware since then. And because of that, there is obviously a lot of reverse compatibility issues because we currently are using something called Tobii IS5 now. And Tobii IS5 is all of these years of research and innovation within those 3 different divisions of the company and trying to provide better access and better usability. So unfortunately, you wouldn't be able to use computer control with that camera. But what I wanted to touch on is that when we talked about eye tracking before, and I had mentioned that I was going to bring this up during the presentation, and we talk about it in terms of eye tracking used to be so inaccessible, and that's why you would have a system maybe for 15, 20 years because the cost component might be $16, $17, $18,000. It'd be very, very expensive. So we've really, really pushed hard to make what we call peripheral eye trackers much less expensive than they used to be. And now, for instance, the camera that I'm using right now, I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment because I'm actually going to pull this hardware for you guys to be able to see. So give me just a moment here to just mute myself briefly. You might have to, actually, I'll keep myself unmuted. That way, Doug, you don't have to worry about that, but I'm going to stop sharing my video for just a moment.
Okay.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to pull this eye tracker up. So we talked about the fact that eye tracking as far as access goes. So here's the bar that I'm actually using today. Okay, this is a Tobii PCI 5. Okay, and it is our latest peripheral eye tracker. It's got 3 different diodes. Okay, and this comes with a carrying case. Okay, and we use it and we encourage a lot of, when I work with clinicians, I talk about increasing the use of the different tools that they have available in their toolbox. So eye tracking, again, that $15,000 to $16,000 price point. This entire system with computer control is $1,500. Okay, and what is nice about this, and I'm not going to do a sales pitch for you today, but what I think is really nice about this is before what it used to be the case is that you would have an activation code designed to a certain software, to a certain computer. So I'm just looking around different names here. So Mike might have an active access code with a camera that he wouldn't be able to share with Ann or be able to share with Jim, okay? If let's say you worked at the same site or the same center. And so one camera went with one computer, one system at all times. And just talking about innovation, talking about development, this PCI 5 now has a physical access key. So what that means is you could have one clinical site with one camera and one single license on 6 different computers. And all you have to do to access the software is plug in the USB. And then the software becomes accessible. So what we've tried to provide is really a clinical access tool. So rather than you having to have the system that is maybe 10, 15 years old, you can have a system that is obviously financially, it's much more attainable, especially for families that need to be able to access for their kiddos complex access needs like the use of eye tracking. $15,000 is way outside the window. Okay, you're talking about funding a car at that point. So we tried to make this system even cheaper than most laptops and desktop computers. And what's nice is that with every single camera, it comes with the software that I just displayed for you today, that computer control, because we have to be able to provide software that is accessible and allows our eye trackers to work. So unfortunately, a very, very long answer, but to be able to answer your question, there's too much innovation that goes into that hardware to be able to incorporate that software that I showed you today into those older eye tracking systems. It's just not possible.
All right. Thank you, Charles. And sorry, Jim, the C4 maybe will live up to its name. You might have to detonate that and upgrade to some of the new equipment.
And I completely understand. I work with a lot of loan libraries, work with a lot of banks that hold on to equipment as long as possible. They try and keep it running, and there's good reason to do that. Unfortunately, there's only so much there's only so much we can continue to make hardware do for us. And that's why we have to, improve our PCs and constantly be trying to innovate. And technologies, this world is this big curve that continues to accelerate. And so trying to keep up with that curve can be very challenging. And so at least our hope was with our peripheral eye trackers is that by making it financially more possible for a lot of our clinics and families to be able to access, that would improve their ability to have the latest software as well as hardware.
Okay. All right, we've got a few other questions that were put into the chat here, and I just remind people as we're kind of coming to a close here is to add your questions into the chat or your thoughts or comments. And again, I'm keeping an eye on microphones if anybody wishes to join in by voice. To please raise your hand or unmute your microphone. So Mary Lee has a comment or a question here of, can this software be used with student Chromebooks specifically for the K-12 population?
Very good question. So we hadn't really touched on operating systems. So when you're using Chromebooks, you're using something called Chrome OS. And Chrome OS is this sort of Android-based operating system. And Tobii Dynavox used to use Android OS as well as Windows OS. And obviously we have some software that's available on Apple iOS as well. The reason for why eye tracking is no longer compatible with Android-based systems, including Chrome OS, has to do with the remote access features of a desktop. So we know that from a support standpoint, that sometimes we have to continue to support users for many, many years. And to do that, it's very difficult. Obviously, we know in Canada, we have users that are spread out, sometimes over great distances. So when we're supporting users, it's important to always consider that we have to support them remotely and remote applications. So from a Tobii Dynavox standpoint, the only operating system that really gives us the ability to do that and do that well is Windows OS. So for that purpose, that's why we only have eye tracking that is available through the Windows-based operating system.
Okay. All right, Alice has got two questions in the chat for us. First is, if the user is not a good reader, can the text be read aloud?
That's a good question. So we have, although I didn't touch into all of our software, so we have communication-based page sets, okay? And those communication page sets, oftentimes we set them as a home page for a user. We have something called Communicator 5, as well as the Snap Core, the TD Snap frame of communication. And those page sets are designed for users that need multimodal access. Maybe a user needs to use symbols to be able to communicate. Maybe they need to use text only. Maybe they need no text. Maybe we don't want to have any text at all on the buttons. So we would use we would pair the computer control, which is the desktop software I just showed you, with a communication software that suits the communication requirements of a particular student or user. So if a user was not literate, we could maybe just use symbols within their page set. That's perfectly appropriate, and that is available.
All right. And then Alice's second question was regarding those users with cerebral palsy and whether using eye gaze with those users having a lot of movement. How does eye gaze work with those users?
Sure. I'm going to touch on just a couple things. So we have what's called, it's a three-dimensional gaze box, okay, in front of our eye tracker. So you can see me on the camera. That eye tracking box starts at about 28 inches away from the camera and goes all the way to about 20 inches past that. So really it gives you about this 20-inch window of movement towards the eye tracker and away from the eye tracker, okay? As well as you have about that same distance widthwise. You have this three-dimensional box that sits out in front of this eye tracker. And as long as positionally, when we talk about positioning with eye tracking, positioning is maybe the single largest barrier to eye tracking. Because positioning has to be achieved. And when we look at someone with cerebral palsy, maybe their tone changes throughout the day, and therefore maybe their level of recline in their chair might change. And so it's always important to consider when you look at positioning with eye tracking. We look in terms of parallel. So if the user, I'm going to turn to the side now. If a user is in their chair and they're facing and they're nice and upright, we want that camera to be directly out in front of them, anywhere between 28 to about 36 inches. Okay. And within that three-dimensional box, they can move all around. And as long as their eyes continue to be on that screen, our eye tracker will pick them up. okay? And it will remain quite accurate. And it's also, it's important to consider when we're talking about parallel is, let's say that positioning changes. Maybe that user goes to the side, okay? So when they go to the side, it's important to position that camera to meet them where they are, okay? And that's exactly how eye tracking is supposed to work, is that we meet them wherever their positioning is through different mounting systems. So whether they're incorporating a wheelchair mount or a desktop mount or using a floor stand, we want to be in the same parallel with their face with that system. So regardless if maybe they're supine, maybe they're laying back they're on a bed, we want that parallel screen to be parallel to the user's face at all times. So regardless of what the angle is. And there's a lot of really great mounting equipment, either Bill Johnson with Ideas in Canada, as well as there's another great Canadian company, that being Daisy Mounts. And then there's some other North America, and our chief supplier of mounting equipment is a company called Rehadapt, and we have our Connect It line. But we also work very closely with Bill Johnson as well as with Daisy mounting systems too. But so getting to that, so we just want to make sure positioning wise that we parallel the face at all times. So even with a user with cerebral palsy, those motor movements, whether we have a user that has tremor, or whether we have a user whose tone changes, it's just important that we try and meet them where they are.
All right, and Lyle is curious about the laptops with built-in Tobii, such as the Dells. Are they designed exclusively for gaming, or could they be adapted for people with mobility disabilities?
So in terms of Tobii Technologies, so Tobii Tech works, they have a subsidiary called Tobii Gaming. And Tobii Gaming incorporates, just like Tobii Tech, OEM solutions. So the same software and eye tracking that is in Alienware gaming laptops is the same base form of technology that is in our eye tracking as well. The important distinction is the application. And this is something that I always try and touch on. So what is the purpose, the operating system, and then also the overlaying software that Tobii Gaming eye trackers work with? What is the purpose of the eye tracker? And in a Tobii Gaming laptop, that eye tracker is purposed for peripheral eye tracking adjustments to a user interface. What does that mean? That means that if a user is playing a game like Assassin's Creed, like a first-person game, or if maybe they're playing a racing game, we have something called focal attention with gaming. So if I look at a certain target on the screen, what will happen is maybe the rest of the screen, the rest of the viewing space becomes blurred, because that's actually how our vision works. If you're looking ahead on your screen, and then if you've got a lamp, or you've got maybe a picture hanging on the wall, it's all blurred because we have focalized attention. And the gaming community wants to make their experience more immersive. So that is incorporated with a gaming eye tracker. Additionally, some other component that's really, really important is with gaming eye tracking, you also have other things like streaming. Streaming is a huge part of the gaming community, like if anybody's familiar with Twitch. So what we want to do is, maybe a professional gamer wants to be able to show their audience where they're looking when they're playing a game. So we're able to show basically that gaze bubble, sort of, where that gamer is looking on the screen. But unfortunately, the access software, the use of accessibility tools, that's all Tobii Dynavox. So the use of that camera and the programming and how that camera is made up, for instance, Tobii Dynavox eye trackers like the PCI 5 has something called outdoor TD. So it allows eye gaze users to operate eye tracking outdoors. You would never be able to do that with a gaming eye tracker. Okay, it's just not purpose built to be able to do that. So there's some cross research and application, but the actual use of the eye trackers are very different.
Okay, that's all right. Thomas has asked a couple kind of related questions, so just together here. They're both seem to be regarding customization, about adjusting the size of the gaze bubble, as well as bigger text in the guide text. Is that those two adjustments able to be something able to be made?
So, and this is important. I'm not sure if it was Jim or someone who had brought up the C4 camera before.
Jim did.
Okay,
Yep.
so this is a really, really great point, because when you're talking about new technology and computer control is currently, that is our desktop software that we're moving forward with. All of the developments that you've seen from back when I showed you our earlier desktop control, where you had the taskbar along the right-hand side and you would select an action, then put that action on something. This has all been developed from user feedback. Okay. So right now, I don't know of larger text that's available within the quick start guides, but we take that feedback and then we work extremely closely. We work very, very closely with our product managers. So like after this presentation, I actually have a presentation feedback that I submit to our product team after I get feedback from clinicians. And this is going to be feedback that I'm submitting. So because you asked that question, I'm going to be submitting feedback right to our product team about making text sizes larger in the quick start guide. I don't know how that topic hasn't come up already. It probably has with our team. So they have to prioritize based on the feedback they receive from us, what things they need to develop in the product. And I'm guessing that increasing the text size is probably something that's been a frequent request. Great question.
Great, and that's important for us as assistive technologists and clinicians to know as well. Charles, I appreciate you sharing that inadvertently. There is that our feedback does go back, and it doesn't just land at your desk. It lands right at the place where it actually can make a difference.
Yeah, it will actually go directly to the product developers. So that is, and actually all of the entire innovation process at Tobii Dynavox, it actually incorporates about 90 to 95% user feedback. So everything that's developed is feedback that comes directly from our users and the clinicians that are assisting them. So that's how we innovate, because otherwise we don't know what to look for. You don't know what you don't know, as a popular term to use.
Yes, right. We will be providing your contact information as well as part of the replay resources and today in a few moments in the chat. So be prepared for some feedback, I would expect. Jim has asked a question. He says that he thinks it's been answered, but I don't want to make that assumption and leave Jim out with some product information. He's wondering what kind of product you'd recommend for a special needs lab. And he thinks that PCI is the answer.
Yeah. So when I look at, and I try, again, I don't want to make the recommendation for you. I can obviously tell you, what exactly we have that's available. So when you're looking at eye gaze access, instead of having a, $15,000 to $20,000 solution that you're looking to explore, the PCI 5 is, it's $1,500, I think, Canadian, I think is the total cost. But when you're looking at that from a financial standpoint at a clinic, that's actually pretty usable, and it's high utility because you can use it across your entire clinical team. And essentially, with this, it literally comes with the eye tracker as well as 2 switch ports and a magnetic bar. And what's great about that is the magnetic bar affixes to your laptop or your desktop computer. And so if you always have your laptop available when you're assessing a client, you can mount your laptop, and then you just therefore made your laptop into an eye tracking assessment tool. So I think that the PCI provides a lot of usability. It's high utility because it's super easy to carry around. It's functional. You can put it in your computer bag. It's not big and bulky. And again, you can share that license with as many different clinicians as you want. And as long as the clinician has the eye tracker prior to their assessment, they can assess with eye gaze. Something else that I haven't incorporated yet, but if you think about a user like that needs a workplace accommodation that's using their mouse and their keyboard, maybe they might need a break in the afternoon, but they want to continue to work. They could turn on, they don't necessarily have to have their eye tracker working all the time. They could just have it attached to their desktop workstation. And maybe towards the later end of the day, they just want to type with their eyes. That's functional. That's very, very functional. And if you're trying to prevent a workplace injury or trying to decrease symptoms associated with already an existing injury, that is something that you can definitely explore because it's just another way we access our computer.
All right. We got one more question, one comment, and just as we take those last two there, I just remind anybody who is possibly looking to add their question or comment by voice to please unmute or raise their hand, and we'll get you on as well just as we're wrapping up. Thomas has one other question. From a multimodal perspective, what has been the experience with combining eye tracking with speech recognition?
That is a great question. So we have worked with programs like Dragon before, as well as utilizing AI-based systems Like I know that we have worked with different systems. Like a really important one to look at is like we worked with a lot of ALS clients with ALS. So we do something called message banking. If you have any experience working in the ALS community, message banking is super important. We're trying to prolong the speech and the messages as well as the voice of a user with ALS, and then therefore we can either digitize or synthesize their voice and then deploy that on buttons within a device, so that when they say hello or they say, you know, I love you to their spouse, it's their voice coming through the device, either synthesized or the actual recording of their voice saying it. And we utilize AI systems to be able to log and store all of that information. So as far as the research component, to utilizing voice, like if you're going to be using something like Dragon and you're writing into a document, it'd be no different than you using an actual computer mouse, because that's it. The operating system is noticing the same thing. It's no different to the operating system as if you're using a traditional mouse to access the Windows OS, because we're just overlaying Windows. So there's a high utility of function when you're talking about eye tracking, because you're not changing necessarily what the operating system sees. So even if you're employing like a system like Dragon, some sort of voice recognition or voice to text system, if you open up a Word document using eye tracking, you can begin using your voice to text, no different than you would if you were using a traditional mouse.
All right. Great. And Colin is just sharing a piece of feedback in addition to what you had mentioned, Charles, with regards to people with CP, that Colin worked with a client who had lots of movement. Only when they started using the new Tobii I13 that it was successful, and the new camera and software made it successful, whereas the Tobii I12 they couldn't use. So just to add there.
Yeah, and it's important that same, so Tobii, the i13 and i16, the i-series devices, which are very expensive and are much more traditional to what folks have seen in eye tracking in past years, utilizes the same exact hardware and the same exact desktop control on the PCI 5. So you're talking about the eye tracking component that is within this, $16,000, $17,000 device that could be deployed and used as an assessment tool or as a form of multimodal access to a workstation, to give a student access, to give an employee access, to give a user access to their desktop, for really something. It's a solution that can be financially feasible. So it's something to explore. And then also, I know with the I-series, we also incorporate outdoor eye tracking. So it's the same eye tracking component that's in the PCI 5. So essentially, you could hook this up to a Surface Pro if you wanted to, make the Surface Pro mountable, and then use that as an eye gaze system. It's important that there are definitely use cases for having a completely integrated system like an I-series. CP is definitely something to explore with that. And oftentimes there is provincial funding and national funding for more of those expensive systems.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Charles. I'm not seeing any other questions or comments into the chat, and I haven't seen any microphones or unmuted or hands risen. So I think we will kind of wrap up for the day here. I appreciate all of the information, Charles, that you've provided with us. You've also, unknown to the majority, I'm sure, that you've been part of our first international webinar. We've been joined by a person from Finland today, so it's almost, it's probably past their bedtime. So we appreciate them staying up late and being with us throughout this session. So everyone else as well, I appreciate you staying with us and digesting all of this information, the massive amounts of information that Charles, you shared with us here today. I don't know where to begin to sum it up, because
well, we're happy to do it, Doug. We're very happy to do it. Thank you so much for the Network of Assistive Technologists for being able to host me today. And then Doug, I really appreciate all of your help, as well as again just thanking your community of clinicians and all of your membership, as well as those guests that were able to join us today. Thank you very much.
All right, and I have put Charles's information, his name and contact email address into the chat, as well as a part of the replay resource page. It'll be there, along with his slides and the replay of the presentation And there's been a couple resources that he's mentioned as well that I put into the chat earlier, and we'll make sure that those are on the resource page for the replay as well. So yeah, it's a fantastic presentation, Charles. As assistive technology professionals, we always want to add to our toolboxes, and we're the first ones to admit that they're never full, but at the same time, we wonder how we're going to fit any more in them. But people like yourself and the Tobii Dynavox company, you bring this technology to us, and we find a place for it because we know that there's a need for it out there. So now we know where to put it in the toolbox, and we also have some context as to when to pull it out. So it's no doubt this information is going to further assist us in better serving those that we support. And again, your continued support of the assistive technology profession and the accessibility community, as well as the network of assistive technologists, it's greatly appreciated, Charles. We look forward to keeping the AT community up to date as to the happenings at Tobii Dynavox. So please stay in touch with us. And if there's any developments, anything new that you'd like to share with us, don't hesitate to reach out.
Will do. Thank you so much again, Doug. Take care, everyone.
All right. And lastly, for everyone here today, thank you for joining us. And remember, you can't spell education without AT.